cotton industry in Uzbekistan actually are based on forced labor, and this is a unique situation because this is state-sponsored child labor and forced labor.
State-sponsored slave labor. That's what Human Rights Watch calls the Uzbek government's annual cotton harvest. Uzbekistan is one of the world's largest exporters of cotton, and partly what keeps production so high is the steady supply of people plucked from their regular jobs and sent into the fields to pick cotton. A report by the aid group says an estimated 1 million people, made up of teachers, doctors and other civil servants, are called up to harvest cotton against their will. If they refuse, they can face penalties and punishment. And Human Rights Watch says the World Bank bears some responsibility. That's the institution that provides loans to fight poverty. But they've allegedly given $500 million to Uzbek agricultural projects linked to forced labor. Well, we asked the World Bank to come on the show to defend themselves. They declined, but they did give us this statement. They said the World Bank does not condone forced labor in any form and takes seriously reports of incidents in the cotton sector in Uzbekistan. We have been working with the International Labour Organization to put in place a robust monitoring program. Similar to 2015, in its post-2016 cotton harvest monitoring report, the ILO stated no incidences of child and forced labor were identified with regard to World Bank-supported agriculture, water and education projects. Well, the Uzbek government also didn't put anyone forward to appear on the program. But to unpack these issues, we're joined now from Berlin by the director of the Europe and Central Asia Division at Human Rights Watch, Hugh Williamson. Hugh, good to talk to you. You heard the response from the ILO. You heard the response from the World Bank. Does any of that make sense to you, and do you accept their explanations?
First of all, thanks so much for having me on the program. I appreciate it. It makes some sense because it's the perspective from the World Bank and the ILO we've had before. We should go back a step and remind us that in 2014, the ILO committed to underline their view, quite right view, that forced labor in the cotton sector is unacceptable in Uzbekistan. And they said that if there was evidence presented that there was indeed forced labor, then they would suspend their loans, as you say, $500 million of loans in the last few years to agriculture projects. We feel in our research report, which we did with the Uzbek German Forum, another NGO, we've provided that concrete evidence. And we think now that the World Bank should suspend those loans and enter into negotiation with the Uzbek government until forced labor is eradicated, at the very least, in the projects that they are supporting in terms of agricultural investments.
Yeah.
If we look at the ILO aspect, that's the slightly more complicated aspect, because as the ILO, as the World Bank said, the World Bank has commissioned the ILO to do monitoring, to investigate whether there's forced labor in the cotton production in Uzbekistan. The problem is, because of the very nature of the authoritarian government and authoritarian situation in Uzbekistan, the ILO is not in a position to do independent monitoring.
Right.
They have to work with Uzbek government officials. And that means that ordinary people who are picking cotton will not come forward and admit they've been forced to go to the fields. So essentially, the ILO comes up with reports and says, we didn't find any evidence because nobody came to us.
Right.
Well, obviously, it's understandable that nobody would come forward because they would feel threatened and intimidated and may lose their jobs or worse if they did so.
Okay, so let's separate this out a little bit. Let's say, granted, there might be forced labor, at least on a sort of minimum level. There must be some forced labor, some child labor going on in Uzbekistan. But is it possible to categorically prove that World Bank-funded projects have forced labor within them?
Categorically prove is obviously a tough bar, a high bar to reach, but we feel we've done the most detailed research in recent years at least, because we're working with an organization which has a network of independent researchers, monitors on the ground who are in touch with ordinary people, and they've sent in hundreds and hundreds of reports from the cotton fields in every harvest in the last several years, and we've compiled that information. And people are willing to talk to these monitors because they're not associated with the government. So we do feel we've combined that evidence with leaked government reports, which says very, very clearly that students will be thrown out of university, that teachers will lose their jobs, that unemployed people will lose their welfare benefits if they do not go to the field. So a combination of the research we've gathered from ordinary people, plus these leaked government documents, we feel is convincing evidence, at least, that, that there is forced labour in World Bank projects.
Might it be possible that this is something that's a part of Uzbek culture, where people go out and feel as if they want to help their economy and help their country, and so there might not be as much coercion as is presented in the report, and that those who are forcing people are just a bunch of rotten apples? Might that be plausible?
That's an interesting, the rotten apples aspect is an interesting one. I mean, the Uzbek government presents this as part of their culture, part of a long tradition of helping the agricultural sector at a particular time of the year. We're not denying that there's a sort of cultural element to it, and some people do voluntarily go to the fields. We should emphasize that. But there's clear evidence that a large number of people, 1 million people we estimate, are forced to do so. They would rather not do so, and they would face financial or other implications if they did not go to the fields. The point about the rotten apples is that this is a system-oriented, a government-organized forced labor scheme, and it's controlled from the top. The current Prime Minister, President Mirziyoyev, used to be Prime Minister, and he used to control the whole cotton harvest system. And we have transcripts of meetings he had before he became president last year, that he instructed local government officials to go and recruit people and force them to go to the field. So I think that the rotten apple argument is a flawed one.
Do you think the World Bank is in denial?
I think it is. The World Bank is very keen to engage in Uzbekistan. It's a large economy, the largest country in Central Asia by population. It wants to remain in the country. Its line of business is to give investments and to engage with countries like this. But the World Bank should recognize its own guidelines, say that it should not support forced labor. It should also, by the way, listen to business. There are over 270 very prominent companies which have boycotted Uzbek cotton in their products. Companies like Nike, H&M and Gap all say we don't want to use Uzbek cotton. So they should listen to that community, as well as human rights organizations like ourselves and others, in coming to a clear decision, suspend the loans, but work with the Uzbek government to eradicate the problem.
Right. And very finally, politically, Prime Minister Mirziyoyev is supposed to be a reformer, at least in comparison to his predecessor. If you had direct access to him, or you could directly speak to him, what would you advise him to do?
I would certainly encourage him to go to add meat to the rhetoric he's already come out with. He's argued for more transparency, for better governance in the country. He's allowed some prisoners to finish their prison terms on time rather than extend their sentences. He's allowed the UN back into the country in terms of their Human Rights Commissioner. He should take concrete action, allow other political prisoners to go free, and symbolically ending forced labor would be such a significant move for the country because it has such a wide resonance around the world. Many people know that forced labor is a big problem in Uzbekistan. So we could really turn the page, if we wanted to, by eradicating forced labor and creating an economic scheme where they would be paying unemployed or underemployed people to go to the fields instead and pick the cotton.
Hugh Williamson, good to talk to you.
Thanks so much for your time.